Before the first twilight, Maria receives the letter and the umbrella from Beatrice. This was done by Rosa acting as Beatrice. I have already demonstrated that Rosa is Beatrice, so all that is required is for her to have had the opportunity to give Maria the umbrella and the letter. Rosa is found sleeping on the couch by Genji. However, before that she has no alibi at all. A lot of time has passed since Rosa left Maria behind in the garden, so just because Rosa was lying on the couch, that tells us nothing about how long she had been there. For all we know, Rosa had been there on the couch only for about 5 minutes and could even have pretended to be asleep and pretended to wake up when Genji laid a blanket over her. In other words, Rosa had lots of time to go back to Maria and give her the envelope and the umbrella as Beatrice. So now we can move on to the first murder scenario. Six people are found in the garden shed, namely Goda, Rudolph, Kyrie, Kraus, Rosa and Shannon. The people standing outside can only see 5 bodies, but Nanjo, Cannon and Hideyoshi are inside the garden shed. Shannon's corpse is lying outside of Battler's and George's side. So what is Will's solution regarding the first twilight of the first game? Illusions to illusions. The corpse that cannot return to Earth returns to illusions. So what would be the explanation of the first twilight from the perspective of the official explanation? It would be as follows. There are only 5 corpses in the garden shed. Shannon is actually standing there in her Cannon disguise. Hideyoshi and Nanjo are Shannon's accomplices. In other words, Hideyoshi simply lied to George about Shannon being there. So the corpse that cannot return to Earth returns to illusions refers to Shannon's corpse being the illusion. Shannon wasn't dead to begin with. This would be the official explanation. At the end of Will's solutions to the first game, it seems to be suggested that Shannon indeed wasn't lying there and that if George would have walked into the garden shed, he would have seen that there was no corpse. Furthermore, the author even claims this to be so in an interview. This is what I believe to be an example of Ryukishi lying in an interview. Quote, for example, at the first twilight in episode 1, when George was told by Hideyoshi, you should not look at this corpse, if he had gone in, not minding that there would be no face, he would have seen that there was no corpse. It would have meant the end of the incident. However, I have a superior explanation to this murder scenario. Furthermore, the official explanation is demonstrably implausible and unacceptable. First, let me explain why the official explanation is unacceptable. I will counter the official explanation with 2 blue truths. 1. It is impossible for Shannon and Cannon to be the same individual. I proved this in chapter 1. There is not a shred of evidence that Hideyoshi is the culprit's accomplice. Any theory involving accomplices for whom there is no evidence that points to their involvement should never be accepted. So basically all I need to do is provide an alternative explanation and demonstrate that all factors that are required for that alternative explanation are in fact hinted at some part in the story, contrary to the official explanation that relies on an accomplice for whom there is no evidence. So this is what I believe happened that night. George and Rosa, and probably Nanjo as well, took everyone to the garden shed. Whether they were living or dead at this moment cannot be established. Rosa and George probably killed Goda, Kyrie, Rudolph and Kraus together and then tore their faces apart using garden tools. The plan then was to fake both Shannon's and Rosa's deaths using the fake death drugs. George had probably knocked Shannon unconscious using the fake death drug before they killed the rest, since I doubt he wanted her to even know that he was a murderer, since she may very well not have wanted to be with him anymore if she knew that. So George probably carried her to the garden shed and covered her head in fake blood, which would lead people to believe that she would be in the same state as Kyrie, Rudolph, Kraus and Goda. They also faked Rosa's wounds, and after closing the shutter, she would then take the fake death drug. In the morning, Dr. Nanjo would lie about Rosa being dead. That way she could later on carry out murders when everyone was believed to have an alibi. So the corpse that cannot return to Earth doesn't refer to a corpse that is merely believed to be there, but refers to a living person pretending to be a corpse. In other words, my blue truth concerning the first twilight is as follows. Rosa faked her death in the garden shed using a fake death drug. Her wounds were faked as well. Therefore she can be the culprit of the other twilights. And Dr. Nanjo lied about Rosa being dead. However, this alone cannot be the solution to the first twilight. I can already hear believers in the official explanation object to my solution. However, I'm not done yet. So let's use what I suspect those objections to be to further explain my solution. Objection number 1. Will's solution involves only one fake corpse, but in your solution both Rosa's and Shannon's deaths were faked, so your solution contradicts Will's solution. Moreover, how do you account for Will saying that Beatrice would have been found out if George had walked into the garden shed? Doesn't that prove that Shannon's corpse was never there to begin with? Response: I can fully well explain this through my betrayal theory. Remember that I said that Rosa wanted everyone dead, while George wanted Shannon to survive and therefore would fake her death. But in this scenario, Rosa and Shannon were locked inside the garden shed for the entire night together. So the issue of it being a dangerous game right from the start is the fact that George left Shannon behind in a state of fake death when he locked the garden shed that night. So when the crime was discovered the next morning, he believed that Shannon was lying there, still unconscious. However, Rosa never intended to leave Shannon alive. So, in other words, blue truth. That night, after the shutter was locked and George left, and before Rosa used the fake death drug on herself, Rosa killed Shannon and smashed her face apart. Therefore, the next morning there indeed were 5 real corpses and 1 fake corpse inside the shed. If George would have walked into the garden shed, he would have noticed that Shannon now truly was dead and that Rosa had betrayed him. So, Shannon was really present in the garden shed and she truly was dead. Hideyoshi and Cannon did not lie about what they saw. Hideyoshi simply prevented his son from going into the shed to protect him from the trauma of having to look at Shannon's mutilated face. So what Will and Claire are referring to has nothing to do with Shannon being Cannon. They were referring to the fact that Shannon was really lying there dead, and if George had gone into the shed, Rosa's betrayal would have been discovered. That's what abandoning oneself to fate is about. Rosa took a tremendous risk by killing Shannon when this could easily have been discovered. An alternative way for Rosa to have killed Shannon would be that Rosa used the poison to mess with the fake death drug that George used on Shannon, meaning that instead of getting her in a state of fake death, George truly killed Shannon without even realizing it. However, I prefer the direct method of killing by Rosa, yet both are possible. But there are probably more objections to my theory, so let's move on to the second objection. Objection number 2. Rosa was lying in view of Battler and the others, so how could she have been playing dead? Response: I advise you to all reread the scene where the garden shed victims are discovered. Battler never even mentions Rosa's wounds ever in that scene, only that she is among the people lying there. But even though Battler talks about his parents' wounds in detail and then mentions Krause's wounds as well, he never even mentions Rosa's wounds, or even Goda's wounds for that matter. In the anime version, Dr. Nanjo is kneeled in front of Rosa performing an autopsy. This suggests that Battler never even had a good view of Rosa in the first place. The detective's authority only implies that when the detective actually examines a corpse, he would not mistake a living person for a dead person. But Battler never examined Rosa's corpse at all. It is not even shown that he had a good view of her in general, so invoking the detective's authority to claim that Rosa had to have been dead will not work. Saying that the detective would notice that someone is dead just at a glance is not what the objective perspective is about. The point is that if the detective specifically searches for something, like a person hiding in a room, he would at least find clues about it. Or, if the detective examines a corpse up close, he would not be fooled into believing that person was merely pretending. But Battler doesn't examine Rosa's and Goda's corpse up close and doesn't specify their wounds. Therefore, both of them at least could have been faking their deaths. Now obviously I don't believe that Goda was faking his death, but the point is that Battler only confirmed with certainty that Kirei, Rudolph and Krause were dead. Rosa and Goda were merely visible to Battler, but not examined up closely. Therefore their deaths were not guaranteed through the detective's authority. After all, there are other instances that even the people believing in the official explanation accept, in which Battler is fooled by something that is in full view, but not discovered by Battler because he never examined it up close. In the boiler room scenario in this game, the official explanation would be that Cannon faked his death, including a fake wound on his chest. Cannon is also in full view of Battler, but he never saw Cannon's wound up close. So that's basically a similar situation. Therefore there is no problem with Rosa faking her death. Objection number 3. After the crime was discovered, the garden shed was locked by Genji and Natsui was holding on to the key. Therefore, even if Rosa was alive, she could not have escaped from the garden shed afterwards to commit any crimes. Response: this, I believe, was specifically put in the story by Ryukishi to deceive his readers into believing the official explanation. Because the garden shed was locked, it is suggested that the culprit must not have been present inside the shed, which would be the case if the Shikanon theory was true. However, this objection fails because not only can I explain how Rosa could have escaped from the garden shed after it was locked, and unlike the official explanation which invokes Hideyoshi's involvement without evidence, I can actually prove that it was possible for Rosa to escape the garden shed. In the fourth game, Battler uses a tool to destroy the shutter of the garden shed to gain entry after discovering Goda and Kumasawa's corpses. Since the garden shed is full of such tools, Rosa could have used one of those tools to destroy the shutter after it was locked and everyone had left. Battler never went to the garden shed afterwards, so we have no objective evidence that the shutter was intact after it was locked by Genji. I even have an alternative way for Rosa to escape the garden shed, namely by escaping through the window. We know that the window is small, but in none of the windows it is shown how small the window is. We have no proof that it isn't just big enough to let a person through. In fact, in the anime version, the window is definitely big enough to let a person through. In other words, there is no evidence that the window in the garden shed was too small for Rosa to escape through, and we at least have a hint that it would be big enough. Therefore, it would be possible for Rosa to escape from the garden shed even if the shutter was locked. I could even have a third possible solution that I don't believe and don't prefer, but if in the official explanation it is allowed to invoke extra people, I could just as well claim that Genji did not actually properly lock the shutter, but merely pretended to seal the lock shut. So in that way, Rosa could simply open the shutter without any problems. And given Genji's extreme loyalty to the family head, invoking his involvement is at least not without evidence, contrary to Hideyoshi's involvement. So even by using an extra accomplice, my theory is still superior to the official explanation. But having said that, I don't believe that Genji was involved in the first place. I personally prefer the solution that Rosa broke the shutter by using one of the tools inside the garden shed, since that is specifically hinted at in the fourth novel. However, escaping through the window is also a workable solution. Either of those will do. Therefore, my theory can account for everything regarding the first twilight of the first game. So let's summarize the factors that my theory relies on and how, contrary to the official explanation, all these factors are hinted at somewhere in the story. Fake death, hinted at in the fifth novel. Erika specifies that fake death drugs don't violate Nox's fourth. Fake wounds, hinted at in the fifth novel. And Rosa's supposed wounds were never examined by Battler in the first place, not even mentioned. The shutter destroyed by a tool. Battler also does this in the fourth novel. The garden shed is in fact the place where tools are stored. The alternative way to escape, namely by escaping through the window. Hinted at in the anime that the window is big enough for a person to escape through. In the novel it is never mentioned that the window is too small to let a person through. And my other alternative way to escape, Genji pretending to seal the lock on the shutter. Genji's extreme loyalty to the family head is hinted at in multiple novels. And the alternative way for Shannon to die, by poison, hinted at in the fourth novel regarding Maria's death, showing that the culprit has access to poison. So that takes care of the first twilight. George is among the rest of the family and Rosa has escaped from the garden shed and has access to Goda's and Shannon's master key. So now let's move on to the second twilight. In the second murder scenario, Eva and Hideyoshi are found in the guest room, both with stakes through their heads. Eva is dead on the bed and Hideyoshi is dead in the bathtub. Genji and Cannon first discover the room locked and chained shut with one of the witch's letters under the door. Genji then orders Cannon to get a wire cutter with Kumasawa to cut through the chain. When they return, the door suddenly has a magic circle painted on it. After Cannon cuts through the chain, they find the corpses. Will's solution to this scenario is as follows. Illusions to illusions. A chain of illusions can only hold back illusions. So what would be the official explanation solution to this scenario? The first impression would be that Cannon, Genji and Kumasawa simply lied about the chain being set, meaning that it was never set in the first place. Or Cannon killed Eva and Hideyoshi after he cut through the chain, so he didn't discover the corpses, he produced them after the closed room was destroyed. That solution is also what the author basically says, or as I believe lied about in an interview. There he says the following, quote, "That portion was all based on the descriptions by the witnesses. But who was it who observed that those two had died within a chained locked room? If you start out like that, the people you should doubt come right to mind." However, even though these solutions don't have such terrible inconsistencies as the previous scenario, there are still some implausibility factors. When it comes to Genji, Kanon and Kumasawa lying about the chain being set, I can already invoke my disproof of the Kanon theory to make the official explanation have to invoke both Shannon and Kanon as culprits. But I guess that some believers in the official explanation would at least be willing to accept that. But if the chain of illusions refers to the chain never having been set, then we would have to assume that Hideyoshi and Eva would leave themselves exposed in their room without setting a chain. Even if you assume that Hideyoshi and Eva were bribed by Shannon, meaning that you also have to invoke Eva as an accomplice, then they would probably still be extremely careful to not randomly trust a murderer. It's only natural for them to suspect that they could be killed as well. So I see it as very implausible that Eva and Hideyoshi would not protect themselves by setting the chain. Also, since the chain was found severed on the ground, you still need Kanon to have really cut the chain, but only from the inside rather than from the outside. So in that case it would be much easier to go for the explanation that Kanon destroyed the chain first and then committed the crime. But in what sense can we then speak about a chain of illusions? We also have to consider that Hideyoshi was murdered while taking a bath, meaning that he never saw the murderer coming. So if the murderer didn't just burst inside after cutting the chain, what I think this suggests is that the murderer was someone who they both trusted and would have had no problem with being in the room while he was in the bathroom part of the room taking a bath. And since it would be expected that they would in fact set the chain to be safe, they would probably only unset it themselves if a person they would never expect to be the culprit wanted to enter the room. Only George really fits that description, since he is their son. So here's my theory. George went to his parents' room and asked them to let him in. Given that it was their son whom they trusted, Eva had no problem letting him in while Hideyoshi was taking a bath. Then George quickly killed them both. This only explains their deaths, not why the chain was set when Genji and Kanon went to the room. After all, George could not have been hiding inside the room since he was among the people that discovered the corpses after Kanon and Kumasawa. So this is where Rosa comes in, who would have been hiding somewhere inside the mansion and had just placed Kinzo's corpse inside the furnace in the boiler room. So, another blue truth. Rosa was hiding somewhere in the mansion and met up with George at a pre-arranged location. After George killed his parents, he left the room and joined up with the others in the parlor. Then Rosa entered the room and planted the stakes in the corpses. She then set the chain and placed the ladder under the door. Then she hid herself underneath the bed. After Genji and Kanon discovered the room chained shut and left again, Rosa went to unset the chain, painted the magic circle on the door, set the chain again and hid under the bed again. Objection number 1. How does this theory fit in with Will's solution? In what sense are we dealing with a chain of illusions here? Response. It's not merely a chain of illusions. Will says a chain of illusions can only hold back illusions. The second part of that sentence is important as well. After all, it is only assumed that a chain of illusions refers to the chain not being set. But that's merely an assumption. It doesn't have to refer to that. First of all, a chain of illusions doesn't mean that there was no chain in the first place, since whether it is set or not, the chain is at the very least there. So what is basically the function of a chain lock? Well, it is to keep people from entering the room even if they have a key. So what I believe the sentence "a chain of illusions can only hold back illusions" refers to is that a set chain makes it seem like it acts like a lock to keep people from the outside coming in. But the culprit coming from the outside was the illusion, and I'm using the word culprit here to refer to the person who set the chain. The person who set up this scenario was hiding inside the room. In other words, the chain that made it seem like it prevented anyone from entering only could hold back the illusion of a culprit coming from the outside. But instead, the culprit, at least as far as setting up this scenario, was hiding on the inside and had full control over the chain, which can be set and unset from the inside. Given that interpretation, Will's solution can basically be rephrased like this. A chain that seems like a lock preventing a culprit from entering can only hold back the illusion of a culprit entering from the outside. The illusions here are that the chain would prevent the culprit from entering, and the other illusion is that the culprit did enter from the outside. Or in other words, that the culprit had to move past a set chain. I think that interpretation fits perfectly well with Will's solution. So what about the other objection? Objection number 2. George was in the parlor with Butler the whole time, so he was not in a position to kill his parents. Response: we don't see what happens for several hours, so we have no objective evidence that George indeed was in the parlor for the whole time, without leaving once. Also, if he acted quickly enough, he could have gone to his parents' room, commit the crime and returned to the parlor in a couple of minutes. So for example, during a bathroom break, he could have committed the crime. Since several hours had passed, it is not strange for George to have gone to the bathroom at least once. Also, already before Eva and Hideyoshi left, it is specifically mentioned that people left the parlor and later came back, as we can see in the following screenshots. But even if you don't like that, then I can provide an alternative explanation in which George is not even involved in this murder scenario, namely as follows. Rosa was hiding inside the guest room from before Hideyoshi and Eva entered. When none of them were expecting anything, Rosa went out of hiding and killed them before they even realized what was going on. Then she hid herself again. This way the chain is not an issue at all anymore, since Rosa was inside the room the entire time. I still prefer my explanation that George killed his parents, but my alternative explanation works as well. And also fits just as well with my interpretation of Will's solution. In this case, my theories can account perfectly well for the second Twilight. In the third scenario, Cannon is found wounded in the boiler room in a puddle of blood with a stake next to him, after discovering Kinzo's burnt corpse. Nanjo then takes care of Cannon in the servants' room and is joined by a concerned Jessica. When they return, he claims that he was unable to save Cannon's life, and Jessica breaks down in tears. The read statements concerning this scenario are as follows. All of the survivors have alibis, let us include the dead as well. In short, no kind of human or dead person on the island could have killed Cannon. Cannon did not commit suicide. Cannon did not die in an accident. So what it basically comes down to is that Cannon was never killed in the first place. In fact, he didn't even die. In other words, no one could have killed Cannon since Cannon isn't dead. Will's solution to this scenario is as follows. Illusions to illusions, the witch and stake of illusions can pierce naught but illusions. The official explanation of this scenario would basically be like this. Cannon faked his death in the boiler room. He is one of Shannon's personas and therefore the culprit. Nanjo is an accomplice and pretended that Cannon had died. Again, I invoke the fact that I have already demonstrated that it is impossible for Shannon and Cannon to be the same person, so you at least have to say that both Shannon and Cannon are culprits. But if you are willing to do this, there is no problem with this explanation. However, I can explain this scenario as well, given my own theory, in two different ways. The first way is almost the same solution as in my original Umineko Explained video. However, I don't believe this solution anymore, and I needed to adapt it a bit because of Will's solution. So even though this is not what I believe to be the real solution, I will still explain what it is, because there is also no evidence against it. And that explanation would be as follows. Cannon was confronted by Rosa in the boiler room, who wanted to make him the next victim. However, Cannon wanted to go against Rosa's plan and actually sacrificed himself, meaning that he tried to take his own life to not give Rosa the satisfaction of including him in her ceremony. Cannon failed to kill himself, however, and merely was wounded. Since Kumasawa and the rest came to the boiler room, Rosa quickly threw the stake into Cannon's blood and then escaped through the unlocked door leading to the yard. Afterwards, Nanjo gave Cannon the fake death drug to fool Jessica into believing that Cannon had died. This way, Cannon would not be able to reveal anything about Rosa. So basically, Nanjo would have assumed that Rosa had failed to finish off Cannon, so now he had a still living victim on his hands. Nanjo himself is not a killer after all, so even though he agreed to help Rosa, he would not go as far as to actually kill someone himself. However, just leaving Cannon as he was would be too great a risk. So Nanjo simply used the fake death drug to have Cannon be unconscious as long as necessary. If Rosa then wanted to finish the job, she would have to do it herself, but at least Cannon would no longer be a threat. To connect this to Will's solution, the stake of illusions applies to the fact that the stake was stained with blood, which gave the illusion that it was the weapon that pierced Cannon. The witch of illusions would not refer to Cannon being alone in the boiler room, but to the culprit being a person who was believed to be dead. In other words, Rosa was believed to be dead, yet she was still roaming the mansion as the murdering Beatrice, making her the witch of illusions. But, as I said, I don't believe that this is what actually happened in the boiler room. Because even if Cannon was all alone in the boiler room and did in fact fake his death, like in the official explanation, then even in my theory, in which he is neither a culprit nor an accomplice, I can still very much make sense of that. So I truly believe that Cannon did really fake his death in the boiler room, even though he is neither the culprit nor an accomplice. Now some of you may probably be very confused by that, but remember what I said in the previous chapter about Shannon and Cannon probably being aware of what is going on, suspecting that Rosa indeed is carrying out the witch's epitaph. In the second novel it is suggested that Shannon is simply accepting her fate, meaning that she allows to happen what will happen. But Cannon is not like that. He is defying Beatrice as she is shown to fight back from the magical perspective, in both the second and third novels, and also to some extent in the fourth. So what actually happens in the boiler room from the magical perspective? What is Cannon trying to achieve in the boiler room? I will first show the anime version and then I'll have the novel version in the background when explaining my theory. Basically what we are shown here is that Cannon is trying to go against Beatrice's ceremony by being the, quote, zero on her roulette. He also said that if Shannon would die before him, he decided to sacrifice himself to bring down Beatrice's ritual. Basically, he is taking control of his own fate. So let's summarize what we know about Cannon. Cannon already acknowledged the existence of Beatrice, shown by Maria's testimony in the 7th novel. The servants and Nanjo acknowledged the new family head as Beatrice. From the magical perspective, Cannon and Shannon are shown to know about Beatrice's resurrection ceremony, the 2nd and 3rd novel in particular. Cannon witnessed Rosa in the garden shed and the fact that the two people were killed in a closed room sealed by a chain that he had to cut himself, meaning that everyone had an alibi apart from the 6 in the garden shed if one of them wasn't truly dead. From the magical perspective, Cannon is shown to have the goal to bring down Beatrice's roulette by sacrificing himself by being the zero on the roulette. In other words, Cannon would have been in the position to realize that Rosa was in fact very much alive and was acting out Beatrice's resurrection ceremony. Since his beloved sister Shannon was killed, he decided to take his fate into his own hands and make himself into the victim of one of the Twilights. By this I don't mean he was trying to kill himself, what I mean is the exact opposite. He was trying to escape getting killed. By faking his death, he basically made himself in a fake version of the 5th Twilight. That way, the 5th Twilight of the ceremony would have been completed, yet without being killed by Rosa. This is what I believe is meant by him saying that he'll be the zero on Beatrice's roulette. Unfortunately, Cannon took a gamble and lost, because Nanjo noticed that Cannon's wound was fake and knocked him unconscious with the fake death drug. So my blue truth is this. Cannon faked his death in the boiler room, sacrificing himself rather than being killed by Rosa. Afterwards he was sedated by Dr. Nanjo. Cannon probably died in the explosion at midnight. This way, Cannon faking his death fits in with my theory as well. In fact, I think that the magical perspective scene fits better with my theory than with the official explanation. After all, in the official explanation, Cannon is the culprit, while from the magical perspective he is shown to try to go against Beatrice's ceremony. Basically, in my theory, the magical perspective scene is symbolic of what really happened, and in the official explanation it contradicts what really happens. So I think my interpretation actually makes more sense. And as I've said before, I think that Shannon's and Cannon's entire behavior makes more sense in my theory. So given this explanation, Will's solution would be very clear. There was no witch and no culprit in the boiler room, and the stake never pierced Cannon's chest in the first place. It was all faked. The only objection I can think of here would be the following. Objection: where did Cannon get the stake from? Response: the locations of the stakes is an unknowable factor since we don't even know where the culprit is hiding them. Nor do we know where the culprit hides the weapons. But we do know that the stakes are part of Kinzo's collection and that Cannon served as Kinzo's personal servant for about a year and for 2 more years after his death. So basically we don't know where the stakes are usually stored or where they are throughout the duration of the games before being found in the victim's wounds. So I acknowledge that I simply have to assume that Cannon somehow got his hands on one of the stakes. This is a weak point in my theory indeed, but I don't think that it's a very severe one, since there are too many unknowable factors here. When it comes to Kinzo's burnt corpse, I believe that Rosa burned his corpse before the second twilight. It takes a long time from the smell to go from the boiler room throughout the dimension, so it's no problem that it was only noticed after the second twilight. Then, I can be very quick about the parlor murder scenario, because it isn't really a closed room scenario to begin with, as 2 of the master keys are available to the culprit. In other words, my blue truth regarding this scenario is as follows. Rosa stepped into the parlor carrying a gun. She told her daughter to face the wall and sing a song. She then shot Genji, Kumasawa and Nanjo. Afterwards, she dialed the number of Kinzo's study, left the phone off the hook, left the parlor and locked it with Shannon's or Goda's master key. So basically, even though Nanjo was an accomplice, Rosa still needed him to die for the ceremony. She was not willing to blast her own daughter's face off, however. She and Maria would die together in the explosion. She acted as Beatrice towards her daughter, explaining why Maria claimed that Beatrice entered the room. The official explanation would basically be the same, but with Shannon or Cannon being the culprit. When it comes to Will's solution, the answer is very simple. It was through Maria's testimony that it was believed that Genji locked the parlor and that Beatrice entered afterwards. However, Rosa simply entered and left the parlor using either Shannon's or Goda's master key. Maria was facing the wall and therefore didn't see her mother leaving using the key. The final murder scenario of the first game is when Natsui is found dead with a bullet in her head. It is shown in red that this was a real shooting murder and not a suicide. The simplest solution is simply that Rosa was hiding somewhere near the parlor and shot Natsui. And the official explanation's version would be the same, but with Shannon or Cannon as the culprit. There is however a problem with one of the red statements here that might actually have to do with terminology. Namely the following. There are no unidentified corpses, and all of the survivors have alibis. Here it says that all survivors have alibis, so that would seem to include anyone who had faked their deaths as well, whether it be Shannon or Cannon or Rosa. However, I myself and most other readers I know of tend to interpret the term all survivors to refer to Battler's group. In other words, Battler, George, Jessica and Maria, or in other words, everyone who is believed to be alive. This is actually sort of suggested by the red concerning Cannon in the boiler room, because there Beatrice specifically mentions the dead as well as people who have alibis, which already should actually be clear because they were dead. So it could be that we are dealing with a problem of terminology here. However, if that's not the case, I do have an alternative explanation ready that at least is possible. Although I want to emphasize that I don't think that this is what really happens, but at least it solves the problem if the red truly prevents anyone who is alive from being Natsui's murderer. So my alternative theory is like this. Cannon woke up after he had been sedated by Nanjo earlier. He got his hands on one of the guns and was going around the mansion trying to find Rosa to kill her. However, he bumped into Natsui, who assumed Cannon to be the culprit, since she actually thought that he was dead, and aimed her gun at him. Cannon and Natsui then shot each other, resulting in Natsui's instant death, and Cannon bleeding to death. Because Cannon didn't die at the location where he was shot, the survivors never saw him, which made Natsui's death appear like a suicide. Again, I don't think this is really what happened, but at least it gets around to the problem of the red. However, I suspect that the issue of the red has to do with terminology, as I said before. But if it doesn't, I at least have an alternative explanation. Now you might wonder why I chose Cannon as Natsui's murderer instead of Rosa. Why not just claim that Natsui and Rosa killed each other? Well, the reason for that is because it seems like Rosa appears to the survivors wearing the Beatrice dress just before the bomb goes off. This doesn't happen in the anime version, but it does in the original novel. Just before the clock strikes 12, they see a female figure and Maria runs towards her saying that it is Beatrice. Then the bomb went off, killing anyone left alive. If I claimed that Rosa and Natsui killed each other, I could no longer account for Rosa appearing at the very end as Beatrice. But if Kennen and Natsui killed each other, then I can. Funny thing is that if this simultaneous murder explanation really is necessary, then Beatrice's appearance right before midnight becomes inexplicable from the perspective of the official explanation, unless you are willing to discard the Kennen theory part of it and have Shannon solely as Beatrice and that Kennen and Natsui killed each other right before the end. When it comes to the letter Natsui was reading not being next to her corpse, there can be multiple explanations. She could simply have put it in her pocket, threw it down somewhere out of sight, or there may never have been a letter to begin with and Maria was either lying or mistaken. Now there are some small issues left regarding the first game that I need to address. What about Rudolph's statement that he fears that he's going to be killed that night? Well, Rudolph is not being literal here. This statement only seems significant because he does in fact get murdered that night. However, as we know from the 8th novel, Rudolph was going to come clean to Kyrie that she really was Battler's biological mother after all. In fact, Rudolph makes this statement after saying that he wants to tell Battler and Kyrie something later that night. So what he was referring to is that Kyrie and Battler would get incredibly angry at him. In other words, Rudolph was saying, in a manner of speaking, you and Kyrie are going to kill me tonight because of what I'm going to confess. He's not being literal, it's simply an expression. What about the bloodstains on Natsui's door in the morning before the first twilight is discovered? Well, Rosa planned to have Natsui as one of the victims of the first twilight. However, when she snuck into Natsui's room using Goda's or Shannon's master key, I assume Shannon's master key as George would probably have knocked her out with a fake death drug before the murders because he wouldn't want her to witness those murders. But when Rosa snuck in, she noticed the scorpion medal on the doorknob. And given the quote-unquote rules of magic, Beatrice would not be allowed to enter that room. So she chose another victim. Oh, and for believers in the official explanation who would object to Rosa sneaking into Natsui's room, this is actually what Ryukishi said in an interview regarding the bloodstains on Natsui's door. The only difference, of course, that he said that it was Shannon, obviously. What about the gold that Krause shows to Natsui? Some people use the scene in which Krause shows Natsui that he's in possession of one of the gold bars as evidence that they were accomplices in the first game. However, I don't see how you can make sense of the first game with Natsui and Krause as accomplices, given that Krause's face was torn apart in the first Twilight, which would rule out Natsui's cooperation. And of course the simple fact that their involvement isn't required in any way, shape or form. It's very well possible that Krause is in possession of this gold bar in all of the games. I think it simply serves as a way to let the reader know early on in the story that the gold in fact really exists. After all, the scene doesn't suggest that Krause was given this gold bar by anyone in the first place, so I don't think this scene has more significance than showing that the gold is real. So that takes care of the first game. As you can see, I can explain the entire first game with Rosa and George as the culprits and only Nanjo as an accomplice. And my theory accounts much better for the whodunit of the first game than the official explanation does, in my opinion. Especially if you consider the impossibility of the Kennen theory. Basically, the only weakness in my explanation was regarding how Kennen got his hands on one of the stakes. But that is not really a severe weakness as it is not inexplicable. So now let's move on to the second game. I can be extremely short about this murder scenario, since I've explained it already. It is both Rosa who claims that the door is locked and who supposedly unlocks it. The servant simply assumed that it was locked, since it is always locked and the key was missing. Only Rosa actually tries to open the door and then claims that it was locked. She's the one who retrieved the chapel key from the envelope in Maria's handbag and then pretended to unlock the chapel door with it. Will's solution was, the gold truth locks the lock of illusions. This is what I explained before. Everyone believed that the door was locked due to Rosa's illusion, which therefore made it a gold truth. However, I think that Ryukishi was very clever with how he phrased Will's solution. After all, if the official explanation is indeed a lie, and if Will knows the real truth, then he had to phrase Will's solutions in such a way that it would seem to point toward the official explanation, when in fact it doesn't. In other words, that a person who believed the official explanation would mistakenly see confirmation of the official explanation in Will's solutions. This is especially true for the next twilight, but this is also the case with the usage of the gold truth. After all, as I explained before, you cannot get around Rosa being involved in the second game. So what would believers in the official explanation tend to assume? Probably that Shannon bribed Rosa with the gold in order to get her support. So when believers in the official explanation would see the term the gold truth appear in Will's solutions for the second and fourth game, they would probably believe that it referred to accomplices having been bribed with the gold. Especially after reading Umineko Our Confession, in which Krause and Natsui are made into accomplices this way. But Will's solution to the second twilight of the second game is especially phrased in such a way that it would seem to imply the Shikanen theory. So let's move on to the second twilight. In the second murder scenario, Jessica is found dead in a room with a stake in her back and Cannon is missing. Will's solution here is as follows. Illusions to illusions. Illusions who have fulfilled their role don't leave a corpse. The official explanation here would be something like this. Cannon and Shannon are the same person. Cannon killed Jessica in a room and then locked the room with his second master key, namely Shannon's master key. Since Shannon ended her Cannon personality in that room, Cannon's death could be confirmed and read. An absolutely incoherent explanation, of course, but given this explanation, the meaning of Will's solution would be obvious. However, I have already demonstrated that it is impossible for Shannon and Cannon to be the same person. So Will's solution to the second twilight cannot entail the Shikanen theory. So can we actually make sense of this scenario with Rosa as the culprit, but which also makes sense of Will's solution and the fact that Cannon's corpse is missing? First of all, did Rosa have the opportunity to commit this crime? Yes, she did. Rosa had sent Genji and Shannon to Kinzo's study earlier on, and then later she followed to borrow Kinzo's gun. So this means that Rosa had the opportunity to go to Jessica's room and kill Jessica and Cannon there. But if that's the case, how did Rosa lock Jessica's room and where did Cannon's corpse go? And how does this fit in with Will's solution? First, let me explain how Rosa locked Jessica's room. Blue truth. Rosa locked Jessica's room with Cannon's master key. But, as we know, when Battler asked Nanjo to look if Jessica still had Cannon's master key in her pocket, Nanjo did in fact pull it out of her pocket. So that would seem to imply that Cannon's master key was locked inside Jessica's room. However, this is an extremely simple trick. Basically, it's like when a magician says, hey, there is a coin behind your ear. So here's my second blue truth. When Rosa joined up with the others, she secretly gave Nanjo Cannon's master key. Then, when searching Jessica's corpse, Nanjo pretended to find the key on her corpse. So that explains how the room was locked. But what about Cannon's disappearance and Will's solution? Since Cannon in a sense appears in the next scenario, I believe that it was part of Rosa's plan to make Cannon disappear in order to set up the murdering demon version of Cannon's scenario. After all, she's trying to make things seem magical. So basically she's trying to make it seem like Cannon killed Jessica and later appeared as a demon who can move in and out of locked rooms without using a key. So the illusion here is that it seems like Cannon killed Jessica and then disappeared while leaving his key inside the room. But in fact, Cannon is innocent and Rosa simply hid his body in another room. So to connect this to Will's solution, illusions who have fulfilled their role do not leave a corpse refers to the role Rosa gave to Cannon to serve as the illusion of being the murderer, and hiding away his corpse made it seem like magic. After all, when the crime is discovered and they discuss how it might have happened, Rosa is trying to make it seem like Cannon is the culprit. Her purpose was to make it seem later on that Cannon was behind the murder of Nanjo and Kumasawa, but not in a mystery way but in a fantasy way, namely through the testimony of the servants later on. This way the second twilight can be explained as well. I actually have yet another reason to believe that Rosa was behind this murder, and a lot of you probably will know what I'm referring to, but I will leave that for the chapter on whistleblowing. This murder scenario is actually the most difficult to explain in detail because there are no hints about what actually happened in the servants' room. Will's solutions don't even include this scenario. So what actually happened here cannot be proven and there are multiple possible versions available. So I will simply give an example of what could have happened. The only thing that I am certain of is the following. The servants were forced to lie about what happened in the servants' room. First of all, there is no good reason to believe that Nanjo and Kumasawa were actually killed inside the servants' room. So let me give a possible version of what could have happened. First of all, Rosa made sure that all the servants went to the kitchen. Then she took Nanjo to the side and had a short conversation with him at enough distance from Battler that he couldn't hear what they were talking about, as we can see in the following clip. Then, at some point, Nanjo drew a gun and held it against Kumasawa's head to get them all to cooperate. Fake blood was poured in the servants' room, and Kennen's and Kumasawa's master key were placed in the envelope. Then Goda had to lock the door. Then Nanjo ordered them to tell that the demon version of Kennen appeared and killed him and Kumasawa. And they'd better cooperate, because if they wouldn't, Kumasawa would die. Moreover, he would probably tell them that he had an accomplice among Battler's group, or even upfront tell them that Rosa was the murderer and that he was working for her. Since Rosa was carrying a gun and Nanjo held Kumasawa hostage, they had no choice but to play along. Nanjo then took Kumasawa away and hid somewhere in the mansion. So Genji, Shannon and Goda returned in shock to the parlor and gave their incomprehensible testimony of Kennen, who wasn't really Kennen anymore, killing Nanjo and Kumasawa. It all went according to Rosa's plan. But not only was it her intention to make it seem like a demon was behind this murder, this was also a way for her to get her hands on all of the master keys. After all, she could now place doubt on the servants' reliability and had them hand over the master keys. This would be vital for the rest of the game. When you read this scene with this explanation in mind, it is really disturbing to see how cruel Rosa is. And after she collected all 5 master keys, George went with the servants and Rosa, Maria and Battler returned to the parlor. So from this point onwards, George takes control of the murder scenarios. He is now supposed to create a perfect closed room with 3 corpses inside it, at least to make it seem that way. So he takes Goda and Shannon to Natsui's room. Problem is, at this point he has no option but to reveal his involvement to Shannon and hope that he could convince her of his purpose and fake their deaths together so that they could later escape the island. Unfortunately, things don't go as he planned. Now we arrive at what would probably be considered the biggest defense of the official explanation apart from the boiler room scenario in the first game. The murder scene in Natsui's room is probably the best hint that Shannon is the culprit. Not only that, but this scenario is actually in detail explained by the author himself. So not only do we have the official explanation in general in the sense that Shannon is the culprit and therefore we can deduce what would have happened in Natsui's room, but we also have an explanation from the author himself. But first let me give Will's solution. Earth to Earth, no one would dispute that a coffin is a closed room. Basically what it comes down to is that Natsui's room is a perfect closed room. The original key is locked inside the room itself and all the master keys are under Battler's surveillance since they are in Rosa's possession and Rosa and Battler are together in the parlor the whole time until they discover the corpses. And it is Battler who unlocks the door, meaning that we know that the door was truly locked. The red also proves that the master keys were indeed in Rosa's possession the whole time, as you can see in the following red statement. Natsui's own key was in George's pocket and the inside of the room was closed off. Only the 5 master keys were left and Rosa was holding all of them. After the master keys came into Rosa's control, never did any of them leave her hands, except for the time when she lent it to Battler to unlock Natsui's room. So basically this is a perfect closed room. This is not about tricks anymore. The only possibility is that the culprit is inside the room. Since there is no possibility of anyone hiding, since everyone else is confirmed dead, one of the 3 people inside the room is the culprit, or at least one of the culprits. In other words, Goda, Shannon or George must either be the sole culprit or one of the culprits in any theory. We have Shannon in the official explanation and we have George in mine. Goda is basically the most innocent person on the island, so he was never really an option to begin with, in my opinion. The official explanation here is as follows. Shannon killed George and Goda and then she committed suicide. This is the reason why she's the only person in the room without a stake in her body. Let's take a look at a detailed explanation by the author of how this went about. Quote, "Still, the locked room in Natsui's chamber is a special case. If Shannon actually committed suicide, there is nobody who can get rid of the weapon. If you think of Genji finalizing that, then it just happens smoothly, but..." And then Ryukashi responds, "Because we have come so far, I think I can give you an answer, though it is basically the same trick as with the well. Shannon died face down, slumped over the makeup cabinet. It's a really simple trick. You tie the weapon to a heavy object with a string. Then you throw the heavy object behind the cabinet. And then it's the classic trick. When you commit suicide, the gun is pulled behind the cabinet towards the heavy object." So that's how it went? I thought because you solved the riddle of the well as well, you would get this trick without any problem. I especially wrote that she was slumped over, face down over the makeup cabinet. And while the other two in the room were actually pierced by the stakes, Shannon was not. That is why you can imagine her being the last to die in that room, because there was nobody left to insert the stake into the gun wound. There was never a full inspection of that special room, so that means that the weapon was left within it. Ah, now I see, I never thought of that. And during episode 4, the same trick was used to drop the weapon into the well in the end. Because of the image of well equals trash can, I imagined that everybody would find it easy to get that trick. And because in episode 2, even before the incident in Natsui's room happened, there was the atmosphere of let's preserve the crime scene until the police arrives. It could have been behind the cabinet or even in the space under the bed. Even if you cast only a little shadow over it, it will already be out of view. That was probably the most difficult part of episode 2. Yes, it would probably be classified as barely hinted. People familiar with mystery novels will recognize this method of suicide, since it's basically taken from And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, in which the culprit commits suicide using the same kind of trick. People who haven't heard of this explanation by the author before might notice that something is not right here. There's a discrepancy. But for the moment I will not challenge the official explanation here and merely focus on an alternative explanation. I will come back to the official explanation of this scenario in the chapter on whistleblowing. But for now, is Shannon's suicide the only possible explanation here? Or can it be explained with my theory as well? And yes, I can. In fact, I can think of two possible explanations. First, I will give the one that I don't actually believe is true, but which at the very least is possible, so therefore it deserves to be included. Although I think it's less plausible than my primary solution. So here's that alternative possibility. First of all, Goda died first in the room. I guess that would be the case in both my two explanations and in the official explanation, since Goda died in the door opening. So it's all about Shannon and George. One thing that we need to take into account is the following. It is specifically stated that Natsui's room was a terrible mess with stuff all over the place. This could arbitrarily have been set up by the culprit, but to me it indicates that a struggle went on. Two people had been fighting inside that room and both died either as a result of that fight or through another method like Shannon committing suicide like in the official explanation. So here is a possibility that I don't believe but could have happened. Shannon and George killed each other. In other words, it was a simultaneous murder. Now I do believe that George and Shannon had a struggle in Natsui's room in both my explanations, but what I'm suggesting here is that the stakes themselves were the actual murder weapons. During the struggle, Shannon took one of the stakes George had with him and stabbed it into George's stomach. George then in a rage took the other stake and jammed it as hard as he could in Shannon's skull. Given the fact that it's almost not humanly possible to jab a stake in someone's skull as deep as they were like in the second twilight of the first game, meaning that the stakes were jammed into bullet wounds, in this instance the stake only penetrated Shannon's frontal lobe, which resulted in immediate death, but the stake did not go deep enough to remain stuck in Shannon's skull and therefore fell out after she hit the cabinet, resulting in the stake lying next to her in a puddle of blood rather than being stuck inside her head. George, however, was lethally wounded as well and dropped onto the floor. Feeling completely defeated over his inability to convince Shannon to join him in their new future and being forced to kill her, George accepted his fate and bled to death. I don't think it can be denied that this is a possible explanation to this murder scenario. However, I don't think this is what actually happened. I do think that there was a struggle, but I don't think that a weak little girl like Shannon would be able to stand up against a young male adult who is trained in martial arts. Of course, we have to take into account that George didn't want to kill Shannon, but the point is that this struggle was not evenly matched. But I do think that George was forced to kill Shannon. After all, in other games, Shannon would not have known about George's plan, and especially not about him being a murderer. But in this game, there would have been no way around of revealing that fact to Shannon, and instead of tricking her into believing that they survived some accident or whatever excuse George would have come up with, he had to come clean and convince her of completing his plan and fake both of their deaths and escape the island later on. However, Shannon wouldn't be convinced, especially after George killed Goda in front of her. So a struggle was the result, in which George, in a fit of rage, stabbed Shannon in the head with the stake and pushed her against the cabinet. Shannon fell face down on top of the cabinet with a stake next to her. So George's plan had failed and the woman he loved was dead by his own hand. However, he was at a point of no return. He could either kill himself or go on living without Shannon, but at least with a lot of money. Given his personality and his determination, he chose the second option. So even though he planned to fake both his and Shannon's deaths, he now had no choice but to merely fake his own. So George put something underneath his clothes to jam the stake into, so that it would look like the stake was inside his body. He could have used a piece of wood or some rolled up cloth or whatever. After all, faking such a wound would be pretty easy. Now some people may object to George faking such a wound, but if you accept the gun trick of the official explanation, which Ryukishi admits was barely hinted at, then there would be no reason why my trick would not be allowed. At least faking wounds is hinted at and even necessitated in other parts of the story. But even better, you do not even have the option to object to George having the stake in his body by his own doing. People who have paid attention would know why that is, but I will come back to this in the chapter on whistleblowing. But there is still something missing in my explanation, namely Will's solution. Will's solution suggests that everyone truly was dead in Natsui's room, and I suggested that George faked his death. But here is where my betrayal theory comes into play, and the fact that Rosa doesn't want to leave anyone alive. So my blue theory is as follows. George killed Goda and Shannon in Natsui's room and then used the fake death drug to fake his death. However, Rosa had poisoned the fake death drug, resulting in George unknowingly killing himself. But wouldn't the poison leave traces behind like it did on Maria in the fourth novel? Well, that's the reason why when Battler, Maria and Rosa entered the room and Battler confirmed both Goda's and Shannon's deaths, Rosa prevented him from investigating any further. Battler never had the chance to examine George's corpse, he only sees him from a distance. Rosa is the only one who examined George up close. I mean, just reread this scene if you want to make sure. Therefore, whatever hints there would have been of a fake stake wound or little traces of foam on George's mouth from the poison would not have been seen by Battler. So by preventing Battler from examining George, this close room murder became complete. Okay, here is a last minute addendum I wanted to add after I had already finished the video, but I was informed by another viewer that it was actually even possible for Rosa to kill George and Shannon and Goda in Natsui's room. Because when Genji went to inform Rosa that he had found Kumasawa and Nanjo's corpses, his knocking on the door actually woke up Battler, who had been taking a nap in the sofa. Rosa could even have snuck sleeping pills or something into Battler's food, since they had been eating food that they took with them to the parlor. So if Battler was asleep, it would have been possible for Rosa to sneak out of the parlor, kill everyone and return again. And since she was holding all of the master keys, it's easy to explain Natsui's closed room. So that means that there is yet another possible solution to that scenario. All that's left are the deaths of Nanjo and Kumasawa. Even though Dr. Nanjo and Kumasawa are the 7th and 8th Twilights, I believe that this murder scenario occurred before the murder scenario in Natsui's room, which would also be the case in the official explanation, by the way. There is no trick to this scenario. George simply sliced their necks open by using some blade like a large kitchen knife or something. Dr. Nanjo believed that only Kumasawa would be killed, but George didn't want to leave Nanjo behind as a witness and killed him as well. Basically, that's all there is to it. I already explained the rest of the second game in the previous chapters, so let's move on to the third game. I've already explained the majority of the third game in a previous chapter, so let's move on to the first scenario, the 6 linked closed room scenario. Before I begin with my explanation of this scenario, I first want to say that I don't see any reasonable way that this scenario can be explained given the official explanation. As I explained way back in chapter 1, the red statement concerning the deaths of the 6 people both proves that Shannon and Cannon are separate people and that there are 6 dead bodies. So no room for wordplay around personalities or stuff like that. The 6 people have to be truly dead no matter what wordplay. In Umineko Our Confession there is a similar closed room chain made in which Shannon commits suicide in the chapel using the same trick as how she supposedly killed herself in Natsui's room. However, that trick cannot be used to explain away the closed room chain in the third novel, since there is the red that none of the 6 committed suicide. Now if you want to say something like that it was technically not a suicide since it was the Beatrice persona killing the Shannon persona or something like that, then it's simply just end of discussion. Just like I said in chapter 1 and chapter 3, there would be no point to even having red statements if the red is that ambiguous, since you can then justify absolutely anything. I mean, you could even make the boat captain a culprit or an accomplice that way. Furthermore, what is the logic behind such a solution to this scenario anyway? In Umineko Our Confession, it is the final murder scenario, so that at least makes sense that the culprit would commit suicide. But this is merely the first Twilight. I guess what believers in the official explanation would want to say is that Shannon simply played dead and that this is allowed by the red since it revolves around death of one of her personalities, whatever that's supposed to mean in the first place. But as I said before, the red simply doesn't allow for such an interpretation. So I guess that the only thing you could say is that Shannon was indeed playing dead, but that she was discovered and then killed by the family members. But I don't really see how such an explanation would help you explaining the rest of the game. Shannon would still be dead and therefore cannot be the culprit of the rest of the game. You could suppose that Eva is the culprit for the rest of the game, but then you cannot explain the murder on Dr. Nanjo. Basically, you are making an incoherent mess of the third game this way. So can I do better and explain it with Rosa, George and Nanjo? And yes, I can. Again, I have 2 possible solutions to the first scenario, but let's take a look at Will's solution first. Illusions to illusions. In a closed room ring, the beginning and the end overlap. People believing in the official explanation would see this as a confirmation of the Cannon theory, namely that Shannon and Cannon who are in the first and the last room are in fact the same person. Ryukishi even alludes to this in the interview. Quote, "That's true, I despaired about the mystery of the linked closed rooms until the very end. Will said that the end and the beginning overlap, but..." And Ryukishi responds, "It's a metaphor, so even the people who understood the hint seem to have done so only barely, because I wrote it that way to distract people who did not understand. I won't explain it further now." However, in this particular place in the interview, I don't think that Ryukishi is lying at all. After all, he doesn't in the end actually confirm the Cannon theory, even though people who believe in the Cannon theory would probably interpret what Ryukishi says here as confirming the Cannon theory. But in fact, Ryukishi is actually very ambiguous here. Also, Kia is actually wrong about what Will says. Will doesn't say that the end and the beginning overlap in this scenario. He said that in a closed room ring, the end and the beginning overlap, which is always the case in a circle. But that, I believe, is exactly the point and the solution to this scenario. That's the illusion. The illusion is that we are dealing with a closed room ring, while in fact we are not. In a closed room ring, the end and the beginning overlap. But in this scenario, the end and the beginning merely seem to overlap, while in actuality they don't. This scenario is not a ring, but a line. In other words, this scenario was already solved by Butler at the end of the 4th novel. Quote, "After the murder of each person in their respective rooms, the culprit created a linked closed room. But the culprit just couldn't return the key for the last room to the inside of that closed room, no matter what they did. But they were able to return it. The first person to discover a corpse just had to pretend to find the key and show that they pulled it from the pocket of one of the corpses." So the answer to this scenario was already given in the 4th novel. Rosa herself was not involved in this scenario since she was keeping the rest of the family members in the dining hall for the night. After all, the family began to focus on solving the epitaph after Rosa confirmed that Beatrice indeed existed, at least the Kuadorian Beatrice. But George and Nanjo did have the opportunity. So it was George who killed all servants apart from Shannon, and Rosa had given him the location of Kinzo's corpse, which he then burned in the boiler room. Nanjo probably helped him carry the corpses since it would be quite a pain to set up this scenario. Then George gave Nanjo Shannon's master key, making it a closed room line instead of a circle, and then, when Shannon was discovered, Nanjo was the one who said that no one should touch her and examined her body. And just like in Jessica's room in the second game, he placed the final master key on her body. Whoever then found her master key would have assumed that it had been there from before they broke into the room, given the illusion of a closed room ring. That is what Will meant by a solution. In a closed room ring, the end and the beginning overlap, like in a circle. But that's exactly what the illusion was. But then we should wonder why Shannon died. After all, George would have faked Shannon's death instead of killing her, but the red proves that Shannon was dead. Well, before I can go into that, we first need to consider another red statement, namely the following. Quote, all of them had wounds resembling gunshot wounds which became fatal. Now in the comment section of my original Umineko Explained video, somebody told me that I read this sentence the wrong way, because I took this sentence to mean that all of the victims had fatal gunshot wounds. But he said that it means that the victims had wounds which resembled fatal gunshot wounds, in which case those wounds were not what killed them. But regardless, I can explain this scenario in both cases. Since I'm not sure which of the two is supposed to be the right reading, I will give two explanations. So here's the solution if the wounds were not necessarily what killed the victims. George faked a wound on Shannon which would appear like a fatal gunshot wound. He then used the fake death drug on her. However, Rosa had poisoned the fake death drug. Therefore George unknowingly killed Shannon. And here's the second solution if the victims did indeed all have fatal gunshot wounds. The death proclamation was made sometime after the victims were discovered, so there's no problem with one of them dying after the closed room was destroyed. Rosa was not present among the people who went inside the parlor where Shannon was. That means that all she had to do was to enter the parlor herself after the rest left and shoot Shannon. As long as this happened before the death proclamation was made, then there is no contradiction. Now you will all of course demand of me to prove that assertion that Rosa stayed behind when the rest of the group went into the room. After all, we know that Rosa was among the discoverers, so where do I get this notion from that Rosa did not actually enter the parlor when the others did? This may sound strange, but just reread the chapter called Virgilia in the third novel. It specifically says that only Rudolph, Kraus, Natsui, Eva, Hideyoshi and Nanjo went into the parlor after Rudolph broke the window, as you can see in this screenshot. That means that Rosa was no longer under surveillance. So after the master key was picked up, they would probably have left through the door and later met up with Rosa. After all, we never see what actually happened, since right after Shannon is discovered, we skip over to the meta world. So there is no problem in saying that Rosa went through the broken window after the rest left through the door. And once Rosa was inside, she took a gun she was hiding on her body, or even somewhere in the room, and shot and killed Shannon. Then she met up with the rest again. Now you may possibly object that Rosa could not have shot Shannon without anyone else hearing it. But according to Umineko our confession, the rifle can be muffled so that it makes hardly any sound at all. This is specified in the scene where Beatrice shoots Kumasawa in her leg to put the stake into the wound. Also, the red only says that it's a wound resembling a gunshot wound, so Rosa didn't necessarily have to use a gun. So it doesn't matter how the red about the wounds is interpreted. In both cases I can account for Shannon's death, even though George intended to fake her death. Either he unknowingly poisoned her, or Rosa killed her after the closed room was destroyed. The only thing that I find strange is how the red is phrased just before Battler gives a solution, since it seems to suggest that all the keys were locked up inside the closed rooms, as you can see in this screenshot. But I think we have another problem with terminology here, just like with the red concerning the survivors in Natsui's murder in the first game. After all, Battler gives his blue truth that one of the keys was planted on one of the corpses directly in response to Beatrice's red truth. So apparently the red should not be read to make a proclamation that all keys were locked inside the rooms, but as a conclusion based on that they were found inside the envelopes and on the bodies of the servants. So this red might have been translated in a bit of an awkward way. Because if the red really was there to prove that all keys were inside the locked rooms, then it doesn't make sense that Battler actually responds to that red truth by claiming that one of the keys was planted on one of the corpses. So I think that it's very likely that we are dealing with some sort of mistranslation or awkward kind of phrasing or something like that. But I don't want people to go complaining that I said that the red should be taken at face value and not be worked around in order to fit your theory. Even though that's not really what we're dealing with here. since we have a pretty good reason to suspect mistranslation or some problem with terminology. But anyway, I will give a third solution in which all keys indeed were locked inside the rooms. Namely the following theory. George either tricked Shannon into believing that they were pulling a prank or convinced her of his goal. He then faked her wound and had Shannon lock the room from the inside and take the fake death drug herself. Then she died either because the fake death drug was poisoned or because Rosa shot her after the closed room was destroyed. Now I don't think that this theory is actually necessary, because I do think that it's a problem with how the rat was phrased, exactly because Battler made this theory in direct response to it. But by including this last solution, my position is safe regardless of how the rat is interpreted. And believers in the official explanation are hardly in a position to object to this last solution, since the closed room ring in Umineko our confession was set up by convincing the servants that they were pulling a prank as well. So that takes care of the first scenario. I've already explained the second Twilight in a previous chapter, namely that Rosa wanted to stop the murders because Eva solved the epitaph. However, George didn't care about Rosa's absurd ceremony, and in the resulting fight, Rosa was thrown on the fence, and then George had to strangle Maria on the spot since she was a witness. Will's solution simply refers to the fact that there are no illusions or mysteries surrounding this murder. There is no closed room or anything else out of the ordinary. It is simply two people who are murdered and nothing that even remotely would suggest magic. The only difficulty here is the same one I have regarding the third murder scenario, so let's move on to that one first. The third murder scenario is when Hideyoshi, Kyrie and Rudolph are killed in the entrance hall of the mansion. You already know what my view is regarding the notion of Shannon still being alive despite the rat. We already know that to be impossible, but it is what many people believe, and it even seems to be what Kia, the guy who interviews Ryukishi, believes. But also a lot of people believe that Eva was behind this murder and the previous one on Rosa as well. However, I see no reason to believe that, especially if you consider that the stakes were used on the corpses. Why would Eva stick a stake in her own husband's body, even if you suppose that he was killed by Kyrie, for example, and Eva then killed Kyrie and Rudolph? Neither do I think that Eva killing Rosa and Maria makes sense. I mean, why would she do that? I don't think that Eva would kill for the gold. Nor would the Rose Garden scenario follow logically from Eva wanting Rosa dead, given that no weapons were used. So sure, it's possible that Eva committed these crimes, but it doesn't really make that much sense, and it's also not required. Anyway, it is actually true that Eva was probably not in her room, since Hideyoshi had been smoking in that same room. But Eva's absence can be explained in other ways than going to Rosa to kill her. Remember that if Rosa is indeed Beatrice, then Eva would now know the truth behind what has been going on the island. So given all the new information she now had, like knowing that Kinzo truly was dead for 2 years already and such, I think Eva slipped out of the room to make certain preparations. After all, she discovered the gold and now she must find a way to get it off the island. And especially to make the rest of the family accept this. But also, Eva would know that she could still be in danger, because even though Rosa had come clean to her, Eva would also know that Rosa herself wasn't the one who killed the servants. After all, Rosa was with Eva the whole night in the dining hall. So just because she could have killed Rosa and Maria, it doesn't mean that she actually did it. I think that Eva slipped out of her room for different reasons and would have been extremely surprised when Rosa and Maria were brought in dead. In fact, this would have been a disaster for her, since Rosa was the one who could confirm that Eva really discovered the gold. But anyway, even though it was possible for Eva to not be in her room, that still doesn't prove in the end that she indeed did leave her room, or at least not that she had left the guest house. After all, given that Eva was sick, she could have spent a long time in the bathroom, and Hideyoshi might have used that opportunity to take a smoke. Now it is probably true that Kyrie believed that Eva had left her room because of the cigarette and therefore proposed that she, Rudolph and Hideyoshi would go to the mansion for food. But that doesn't mean that Kyrie was correct in her deduction. So what I'm trying to say here is that all this stuff around Eva during Rosa's murder and the murder in the entrance hall is extremely ambiguous and even unknowable. My point is that we can only speculate about what Eva was doing at that time, but we simply have no concrete evidence to base any theory regarding Eva's actual whereabouts on. But in any case, even if you want to believe that Eva was behind these murders, then it's not somehow the case that this is compatible with the official explanation and incompatible with my theory. I think it's simply somewhat out of place regardless of what you believe. All I'm saying is that there are simply too many unknowable factors here for us to draw reliable conclusions upon. And I at least don't need Eva to be the culprit in these scenarios. But in the end, my theory simply is the following. George snuck out of the guest house and killed Kirie, Rudolph and Hideyoshi in the entrance hall. I think there can only be 3 possible objections against George being the culprit in Rosa's murder and the murder in the entrance hall, namely the following. Objection number 1. As far as we know, George was in the cousins' room with Butler and Jessica. If he was with Butler the whole time, how could he have been behind the deaths of Rosa, Maria, Hideyoshi, Kirie and Rudolph? Response. I think this is a fair objection, but just like in the case of Natsui's room being locked before the phone call in the 5th novel, it's an unprovable objection. After all, we don't really see what happens in the cousins' room much, so we don't know if George was under the constant surveillance of Butler. Also, consider that it's not that strange for George to ask to be left alone for a moment, since he had lost Shannon. In fact, he does so before he escapes out of the window of the guest house later on in the game. Also, Butler mentions at one point that they were all taking a nap in the cousins' room. Also, George could have said that he went to his parents' room. So even though it's a fair objection, it's not one that can be proven to be true. And there are all kinds of ways to get George out of the cousins' room without being really suspicious. So basically, all I need to assume is that George was not under Butler's constant surveillance around the time Rosa, Maria, Hideyoshi, Rudolph and Kirie were murdered. I do acknowledge that this is an assumption, but the contrary position that he was under the constant surveillance of Butler is an assumption as well. So in my opinion, this is the only weak point in my explanation of the 3rd game, and just like in the 5th game, it's not really a severe one. The second objection would be this. Objection number 2. You said that it would be strange for Eva to use the stakes on the corpses, but since George would no longer be following Rosa's plan, it would not make sense for him to use the stakes as well. Response. First of all, George doesn't go around anymore setting up closed room scenarios because he doesn't care about Rosa's scheme. So he does indeed just kill whenever he has the opportunity. However, given that the first murder scenario was still according to Rosa's plan and therefore seemed magical and had black magic symbols on all the doors, using the stakes would at least provide more confusion and fear. And since George was a culprit from the beginning, he would have known about the stakes. But Eva would specifically have to have been told by Rosa after finding the gold. After all, no stakes had yet been used. So I think that this at least fits better with George as the culprit than Eva. But I understand that this is all a bit subjective. The final objection has to do with Will's solution. Some people may interpret this to affirm that Eva was the culprit, since it implies that we should take these scenarios at face value. However, I think that's a very shallow approach. After all, if you take that literally, you would have to believe that they truly were killed by a witch version of Eva rather than Eva herself. Moreover, Rosa and Maria were in the end killed by Beatrice and not Eva Beatrice. Furthermore, in the next scenario, Will specifically mentions the quote-unquote obvious culprit, which he doesn't do in these 2 scenarios. So why wouldn't the solution to the next scenario also be no falsehoods in the final moments as told, if all 3 scenarios have Eva as the culprit? What I get from Will's solution is that there are simply no tricks behind these murders. There are no closed rooms or anything else suspicious. There are simply people found dead and that's it. I think that's all what Will is referring to. It has nothing to do with who the culprit is. So in conclusion, what I believe happened is the following. George followed Kirie, Rudolph and Hideyoshi from the guest house and then shot Kirie and Rudolph first since they were carrying the guns. Then he shot his father as well and planted the stakes in their bodies and went back to the guest house. There's basically nothing more to it. When it comes to Will's solution to the murder on Krause and Natsui, the people who haven't seen my original Umineko Explained video will probably think that it goes against my theory, since Will's solution implies that Krause and Natsui were killed by Eva. However, the people who have seen my original video know already that I believed this to be so before I read any of the Chiru novels. So Will's solution actually confirms what I said way back in the original video. My theory was that George never intended to kill Krause and Natsui at that specific point in time. Instead, he went out of the window in order to get to the mansion undetected and had Nanjo lock the window behind him. Eva then went to make coffee for Krause and Natsui and put poison in it. And this is exactly what Will's solution implies. which is as follows. Earth to earth, the obvious culprit wields a mutable blade. The obvious culprit almost certainly refers to Eva, and a mutable blade would suggest a weapon that can change form or melt or something like that. So it seems to me that it implies that Eva used poison to kill Krause Natsui, which is what I already stated in my original video. So why did I think that this murder scenario was done by Eva, even though I have George and Rosa as the culprits for all other murder scenarios? And contrary to what most people believe about the previous two murder scenarios, I did not have Eva as the culprit for those scenarios. So what makes this scenario so different? Well, basically there are two reasons. 1. George was most likely not the one who killed Krause Natsui, since he escaped through the window without going to the first floor of the guest house. And apart from George, there was no one left to kill Krause Natsui. After all, Butler, Jessica and Nanjo are all confirmed in red to not having murdered anyone. And 2. Eva actually has a motive in this case. And by now I can add in a third reason, namely that Will specifically mentions the obvious culprit in this scenario, which he didn't do in the previous two scenarios. However, I still believe that Eva probably had not set up the scenario in which Krause Natsui lay under the arbor with strangulation marks on their necks and stakes in their legs. She did kill them, but she probably was really surprised herself to find them in such a state and at a different location from where she had killed them. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So first, why would Eva kill Krause Natsui? In order to understand this, you have to look at it from her perspective. Let's forget about belief in magic and some unknown person hiding on the island for a minute. If Eva would have ruled out those options, who would be the main suspects for being the culprit in Eva's eyes? The only survivors beside her were Krause, Natsui, Nanjo, Jessica, George and Butler. Even though George is the true culprit, she would probably rule out her own son, especially given that Hideyoshi was killed. Butler had lost his parents as well, so he would be an unlikely suspect. Nanjo would be a possible suspect, but he was an old man for whom money would probably have less value than to Krause Natsui. But most importantly, Krause's immediate family was still completely intact. Butler had lost his parents, Rosa and Maria were both killed, and she and George had lost Hideyoshi. But Krause and Natsui were both alive as well as a daughter. Their little family was still complete. Moreover, all the siblings apart from her and Krause were dead. In other words, if she also would be killed, then no one would be entitled to the gold anymore. Krause would be the only remaining child of Kinzo. Also, if Eva would reveal that she solved the epitaph, she no longer would have any support from the other siblings. Kinzo was dead as well. So even if she told them that she solved the epitaph, there would be no way that Krause Natsui would allow her to keep the gold. In other words, I believe Eva began to fear for her and George's lives. I think she believed to have found the culprits, so she decided to poison their coffee. Then she would go and arm the bomb to make the evidence disappear, hoping that nobody would go down to the first floor in the meantime. But then why were the corpses found under the arbor with stakes in their legs and fake strangulation wounds on their necks? Well, let's now try to look at things from Dr. Nanjo's perspective. What if Nanjo did in fact go down to the first floor and found Natsui and Krause dead even though he had helped George escape from the guest house earlier on? So a murder occurred that had not been part of their plan in the first place and Eva would be missing. Therefore, Nanjo would have realized that Eva must have done this. However, Eva was holding a gun, so if he had to defend himself to her, he would probably be in a weak position. He probably also realized that he had been quite foolish to help George escape from the guest house, since he and Eva would have been the only suspects to have locked the window. Also, Nanjo would probably be able to see that Krause and Natsui were poisoned, and that would put the suspicion even more on him as he is a doctor. So Nanjo had to think of a plan. He decided to stage Krause's and Natsui's corpses under the arbor away from the guest house. He had been the one holding onto two of the stakes, which Eva of course wouldn't have known. And in order to make it not seem like they were poisoned, he used a rope to make it look like they were strangled. In that case, a martial artist like Eva would probably be more suspicious than an old guy like him. But he wasn't just trying to put suspicion on Eva. After all, it would be smarter to not make her look too suspicious either. After all, if setting up this scenario would be beneficial for her as well, then it would be a lot safer for him. So in the end, his goal was to make it seem as if Natsui and Krause had disappeared from the locked guest house and became part of the witch's ceremony. This is why when Battler questioned Nanjo on George's disappearance, and Battler figured out that someone must have locked the window behind George, for the first time Nanjo began blaming the witch. He knew that he was in a dangerous spot right now. So Nanjo had placed Natsui and Krause under the arbor and jammed the stakes into their legs. So when Eva came back she would be really surprised, but she wouldn't be in the position to say anything about it, obviously. In fact, it would be beneficial for her. So now let's move on to when George's supposed corpse is found in the parlor. Sometime earlier, George had escaped from the guest house by using the window on the second floor and had Nanjo lock it behind him. The reason he did this was so that he could go to the mansion undetected. After all, his mother and Krause and Natsui were on the first floor, so he couldn't just walk out of the front door. So why did George actually go to the mansion? Well, George was going to revive Shannon, whom he believed to be still alive. After all, he had faked her death that night. This would explain the magical perspective scene in which Beatrice and George go to resurrect Shannon. After Nanjo had displayed Natsui and Krause under the arbor, he would go to George in the mansion to inform him of what happened. However, here is where things really went wrong. He found George next to Shannon's corpse in the parlor, and George had just found out that Shannon really was dead. Especially if this was because of the poisoned fake death drug, Nanjo would have noticed that Shannon truly had been dead when they first discovered her. But he had kept that a secret from George. So now Nanjo had to deal with an enraged George. Given that Nanjo probably had one of the rifles now, remember that Krause and Natsui were both carrying rifles, he saw no other option than to shoot George, who now wanted to kill him. However, since this wasn't planned, Nanjo quickly ran out of the parlor in shock. After all, he had never killed anyone before, and never intended on killing anyone, and then locked the door behind him. So he never checked to see if George really was dead. So now Nanjo was all alone, without allies, and with another murderer somewhere on the island, namely Eva. So in case he wouldn't survive, Nanjo left behind the most important information he had, namely the PIN number to the safe with the money he was promised by Rosa. So that even if he died, he hoped that his relatives would understand what this number was about and would be able to access the money for the sick grandchild. He then returned to the guest house, and later on Eva returned, and to her surprise, Krause and Natsui were missing. But to her even greater surprise, so was George. So now Eva would probably suspect that there was in fact an extra person hiding somewhere on the island. So the whole group went to look for the missing people, and they found Krause and Natsui under the arbor. Then in the parlor they found George. Nanjo checked George's pulse and realized that he was merely unconscious. But of course he would say that he was dead. From this point onwards I have already explained what happened in chapter 3. Basically, Nanjo left Jessica behind in the servants' room to finish off George. But George had regained consciousness already and took his revenge on Nanjo when he stepped out into the hallway. And much later, when George had regained somewhat from his gunshot wound, to whatever extent it would be possible, he went after Eva and Battler. So Eva was then forced to kill her own son and shot Battler. She then escaped to Kubadorian and had the bomb destroy all evidence to create a cat box so that the world would never know that her son was behind the murders that occurred that day. So that is my explanation of the third game. In my opinion, the third game was the most difficult game to explain, basically because there was almost nothing to go on for the entire middle section of the game. My theory makes a lot of sense and ties a lot of things together, but even so, my theory and any other theory for that matter is simply impossible to prove because we are just missing so much information. You have to assume a lot of things and there is hardly any evidence to support any theory at all. Even if you believe that Eva was behind everything apart from Nanjo's murder, it is still difficult to prove how and why she did it. Especially George's death and Hideyoshi's death. You can speculate a lot, but you can prove very little. In any case, you simply have to assume a lot of things in the third game, and that makes it a very difficult game to explain. But I do think that my explanation does account for anything that needs to be accounted for in the third game. But we can never be sure about the exact details anyway. So now there is only one more game to go. If I can explain the fourth game with Rosa and George as culprits, then I have successfully demonstrated that the entire story can be explained with just Rosa and George as the culprits and Nanjo as the only accomplice. And of course Eva as another murderer in the third game. So now let's move on to the fourth game. In my opinion, the fourth game is the easiest of Beatrice's games to explain, since there's very little to explain in the first place. Basically, I can summarize almost the entire fourth game in the following way. The culprits keep most of the family members and servants hostage, call out the kids using the Kinzo has a test for you trick, and then systematically murder everyone. There are actually only a couple of things that need to be accounted for. 1. The appearance of Kinzo at the first twilight. 2. The mysterious calls to the guest house by Kraus, Jessica, Kyrie and eventually Beatrice herself. 3. The appearance of Beatrice to Butler, but I already explained that of course. 4. The close room murder of Goda and Kumasawa in the garden shed. 5. The absence of Ken's corpse, which I also already explained. And 6. Why everyone, including the culprits, are dead apart from Butler at the end of the game. So let's begin with the first twilight. The appearance of Kinzo was basically already solved by Butler at the end of the fourth game. The new head of the family is the new Kinzo. In other words, Rosa is the new Kinzo. Now some people may object that there are also some red statements concerning people only being able to use their own names in the sixth game. However, if we regard the inheritance of Kinzo's name as a title instead of a replacement for one's name, which makes a lot more sense by the way, then there is no contradiction. Kinzo means something like goldsmith or gold storehouse. Basically, you should regard it as a title along the lines of president or king or whatever. It is not a replacement for your own name or even a second name. So that resolves any apparent conflict. After all, titles are allowed since some people already have titles. For example, Rosa is the president of her own corporation and so is Rudolph. So basically what happened at the family conference was that everyone acknowledged Rosa as the new Kinzo. But what led up to this? Because this doesn't happen in any other games. What I believe happened in the fourth game is that Rosa had to use her own contingency plan. Just like George had a backup plan which he used in the fifth game, Rosa had some sort of backup plan as well, at least to some extent, since the fourth game comes a bit across like being improvised. Kraus and Utsui were no longer capable of hiding the fact that Kinzo was already dead. The other family members were on to them and would not rest until their father would show himself or that Kraus and Utsui would admit that they had been hiding Kinzo's death. Since this would inevitably disrupt Rosa's plan to sneakily set up murder scenarios as she had planned, she decided to come clean herself and reveal that Kinzo had made her the new family head before he died and probably used Kinzo's ring as proof. Of course, she had no intentions of breaking off a ceremony. Only the epitaph could prevent that from happening. So she and Nanjo both drew a gun. Rosa probably did kill some people at this point, so that no one would retaliate. So then, Rosa and Nanjo took everyone into the tunnel system under the island and kept them locked up there. But before that, Rosa had to give the appearance of magic to Butler and get him and Jessica out of the guest house. So she forced Kumasawa and Goda into making up a story of a magical shootout in the dining hall acted out by Kinzo. She would probably inform them that she had an accomplice in the guest house as well, so that they would not come clean after they were out of her sight. Moreover, the lives of the other family members and servants were in their hands, so they had no choice but to cooperate. This is what Will's solution refers to. Illusions to illusions, tales woven by the gold truth return to illusions. It is pressed on Butler to believe that something happened that actually didn't happen. Contrary to the other games where magic is merely implied by the circumstances, in this game Rosa has it done by witnesses that tell Butler that they saw magic. In other words, to make Butler believe in the existence of magic on the basis of other people's testimony. This is not merely done by Goda and Kumasawa, but later in the game by forcing Jessica and Kyrie to lie on the phone to Butler about magic. So at the second twilight, Jessica and George both left the guest house, and I believe that it was George who then forced Jessica to call Battler from her room. That's how Jessica quote-unquote knows about George having been killed. Afterwards, George killed Jessica. At what exact point George himself got killed, I cannot be sure of, but I do believe that he is the one who killed Goda and Kumisawa in the garden shed. But let's move on to the third murder scenario first. The answer to this murder scenario is very simple as well, although there are multiple possibilities of what caused the escape. Either this was planned and Rosa simply killed Nanjo as well, or Nanjo actually had problems with his conscience and released everyone. Rosa then chased after them and shot all of them. As I said before, the reason Cannon's corpse was missing had nothing to do with him being a personality of Shannon, but due to the simple fact that his corpse was at the bottom of the well, where Battler was unable to find him. After all, the red proves that he was the first in Kyrie's group to die. Quote, Cannon is dead. Among the 5 people in Kyrie's group, he was the first to die. In short, he was the 9th victim. So no incoherent Cannon stuff is required for this scenario, and the red simply means what it says. So basically, Rosa went on a killing spree and killed everyone apart from Kyrie, who had locked herself in a room. Unfortunately for her, Rosa had the key. Rosa then threatened Kyrie to make the phone call to Battler, where she told him to not doubt the existence of witches. You can basically infer that Kyrie was forced to do this, as there are bullet holes all around her in the floor, suggesting that Rosa shot close to her feet a couple of times to get her to cooperate. So now we are at the final closed room scenario and the only one in the 4th game. Goda and Kumisawa are shot through their heads and hanged in the garden shed. The only key to the garden shed is inside Goda's pocket, making it a perfect closed room. Battler actually had to cut through the shutter in order to enter the garden shed. There he discovered the corpses and the garden shed key in Goda's pocket. At this point he had already confirmed everyone else's death, so there was no possibility of anyone hiding anymore. Will's solution is as follows. Illusions to illusions, earth to earth. When fiction is shut up inside a cat box, it becomes truth. This confirms, in my opinion, the solution that I had given in my original Umineko Explained video. And also proves that George's involvement becomes necessary to explain this scenario. Here is that solution. Jessica and George and Battler were told to lock up Goda and Kumisawa in the garden shed. Then George threw the key through the open window, which Goda then picked up. This is the fiction part, however. In other words, the culprit needed the garden shed key to later kill Goda and Kumisawa, yet he had to leave it behind in the shed as well to create a closed room murder. So this is my blue theory. George didn't throw the actual garden shed key through the window, instead he threw in another random key with the label switched. He later returned with the real key to kill Goda and Kumisawa. Now there is a difficulty here with whether or not the actual garden shed key was found by Battler when he forced his way into the garden shed when he discovered Goda and Kumisawa's corpses. Because Will's solution seems to suggest that fiction was placed inside the shed, but that it became truth due to it being a cat box, namely, is the key real or false? But it is pretty difficult to explain how George could have left the genuine key behind in Goda's pocket. In my original Umineko Explained video, I made a false assumption, namely that the shutter was an electric shutter, so that when you use the key to set it to lock, it takes some time to close, and if George had acted fast enough, he could have quickly slipped the key into Goda's pocket and then roll out under the closing shutter. However, this is not the case at all. It is not an electric shutter. The way the shutter functions is that you manually put it down completely and then lock it from the outside. So the only thing I can think of is the window. After all, Battler never actually checked the window to see if it was locked. It is a general theme that windows cannot be locked from the outside, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be closed from the outside. There's a difference between merely shutting a window and locking a window. So the window could have been closed but left unlocked. And in case the window would not be big enough for George to squeeze through, he could simply have used a wire to place it in Goda's pocket and then close the window but leave it unlocked. But if it's okay that the key Battler discovered was not the real garden shed key but instead the key with the switch label, then there would be no problem at all, of course. However, Will's solution does seem to imply that the key that Battler found was the real one. Another thing that I want to add here is the following. Was it ever likely that Shannon could have committed this murder? Could she really have hung Goda from the ceiling, someone who is constantly referred to as big and heavy, when Cannon couldn't even carry bags of fertilizer in the first novel? But it would be a quite different story for a martial artist like George. I also don't see how you can explain this scenario without George's involvement, since he was the one who threw the key through the window. And Goda throwing the key back out for the killer is also not that likely. Moreover, in what sense then are we dealing with fiction shut up inside a cat box? So now all that's left to explain are the deaths of George, Maria and Rosa herself. In case of George's death, I think it's simply that he was supposed to meet up with Rosa under the arbor, and there Rosa shot him in the head. And that's where Battler found him before his big confrontation with Beatrice on the balcony of the mansion. If she was a good shot, she could have simply shot him from a distance while staying out of George's sight. Because that would have been a lot safer at least. But there really isn't much more to it than this. After Battler found George, he met up with Rosa at the mansion, who was wearing a pretty simple Beatrice disguise. Here Rosa tried to have Battler confess his sin against Shannon, but Battler couldn't remember. Since Rosa carried the burden of Shannon's love for Battler, she wanted Battler to understand, but he didn't. Then everything was over for Rosa. She would leave Battler as the only living person on the island to die in the explosion. So she went to arm the bomb past midnight, so that it would explode in 24 hours. Then she went to get Maria at the chapel and then took her to the dining hall. There she poisoned Maria and afterwards shot herself in the head. Now when it comes to the fact that Battler didn't find a gun, there is no reason that I couldn't appeal to the same trick as Shannon supposedly used to kill herself in Natsui's room. After all, it would be quite hypocritical for believers in the official explanation to believe that this is how Shannon killed herself in the second game, but to object when I used the same trick to explain Rosa's suicide. Even so, there could be another reason why the gun wasn't found. Rosa could simply have fallen on top of it as she had been holding the gun under her chin. Remember that half her head was blown off. And if you want to use a really horrific explanation, then we could hypothesize that Maria actually died after Rosa. In other words, that Rosa gave Maria the poison to use herself and then told her to hide the gun somewhere after she shot herself. I think that goes a bit too far actually, but the point is that there are multiple ways to explain the absence of the gun. As you could have seen in the quote from the interview that I showed when explaining the second game, the official explanation of Shannon's death in the fourth game was that Shannon killed herself next to the well, meaning that the gun would have fallen down the well. The clue to this again would be that there was no stake inside her body. The stake is lying next to her body. However, this is pretty inconsistent. Dr. Nanjo is also lying there and there was no stake in his body either. So did he also commit suicide the same way as Shannon? Why on earth would he do that? And one could even argue that the red truth about Genji, Kumasawa and Nanjo not being killers would even apply to killing themselves. So saying that Dr. Nanjo killed himself is at least difficult to explain, even if it's only about why he would do that. And if he didn't kill himself, if you suppose that he was simply shot by Shannon, then the fact of having no stake inside your body shouldn't be considered a clue in the first place. In the case of Rosa and Maria, suicide actually makes sense. Rosa first gave her daughter an easy death instead of blowing her face apart. Then, next to her daughter's corpse, she committed suicide. That makes a lot more sense in my opinion. Especially if you consider that you need to explain Maria being poisoned next to her mother's corpse if you have Shannon as the culprit. But I already discussed this in the chapter on Who is Beatrice. And then, finally, Battler remains as the only survivor on the island. And when it's midnight, Battler dies as well in the explosion. Game over. So, now it's all over. Here ends my explanation of the murders of Umineko. I have explained all three factors. The who done it, the how done it and the why done it. I have demonstrated at the very least that another explanation exists inside the cat box apart from the official explanation. But I think I did more than that. Given the impossibility of the Shannon theory, the inconsistencies and a conflicting red statement regarding Shannon as Beatrice, and yet another conflicting red statement that I haven't yet discussed, the problematic solutions to the murders given the official explanation, and the arbitrary nature of randomly invoking accomplices without evidence, I am forced to conclude that the official explanation has never been an option in the first place. So if one would open the cat box, whatever one would find there inside, at the very least the official explanation would not be it. I started this video with a very bold assertion that the official explanation is a lie. So now I've given you almost all the evidence against the official explanation and demonstrated that a consistent and plausible alternative explanation exists. So you have to make a decision. Either Ryukishi made a horrible blunder, screwing up his own story and going against his own rules without him realizing it. Or he is very much aware that this official explanation is wrong and that he never meant it to be the truth behind the story to begin with. But as you have noticed throughout the video, at certain points I had left certain things not discussed. I haven't given you all the evidence against the official explanation and in favor of my explanation yet. Because if I'm right that Ryukishi is hiding the truth of the story behind the false chicaneries explanation, then probably certain hints should be found in both the story and in interviews. This is what is called whistleblowing. So in the next chapter I'm going to explain how you could have known that the official explanation was never meant to be the truth in the first place, and also why Ryukishi would be lying about the truth behind the story. Before I will go into Ryukishi's motive, I first want to point out some things in the story that should have made us realize that Ryukishi was in fact deceiving us with a false explanation. The very first thing I want to emphasize is that there are two general rules that are an inherent part of the story, which at no point can be ignored. Those are the absolute reality of the red truth and the subjective or magical perspective, in which many things we are shown as the viewer do not actually take place or are misrepresentations of what actually happened. When it comes to the red truth, basically anything in Umineko can at least potentially be doubted apart from the red statements. Only the things that are stated in red are the things that we can be absolutely sure of. This is emphasized at multiple times. Quote, "The red only tells the truth. The red is absolute, a perfect truth, which no one can overturn no matter how hard they try. The red truth is simply truth, and there is no need to provide evidence, proof, or room for a counter-argument. You can't trust anything. You can't trust any words that aren't red. There exists no one whom you can trust." So when trying to figure out the truth behind the Umineko story, the red truth should be our absolute foundation. Everything else, and I mean everything else, is built on top of that. What we place first on top of that foundation is what we can be reasonably certain of, or what we need to assume in order to make any sense of the story. And that would be the objective perspective of the island version of Battler. Even though we cannot be absolutely 100% sure whether or not Island Battler's perspective really is completely objective and true, we do have good reasons for believing this to be so. Moreover, we kind of need to believe this, or else we lose all context to base our deductions upon, making it impossible to form any theories at all. So basically, without the detective's authority, there is no sense in trying to figure out the truth anyway. So it's essentially a necessary assumption and a very logical one. So this should be our basis for finding out the truth, and this is the basis that I used throughout this video. My entire theory is built upon this foundation. If anything, and I mean anything at all, conflicts with this basis, it should by definition be rejected, or the theory would have to be adjusted. The second inherent rule to Umineko is that of the subjective perspective or magical perspective. For the most part, the reader is being deceived in these scenes. The author is essentially lying to his readers about what is happening, and it's the reader's job to see through the curtain of deception to find the real truth behind it. So in essence, we have the foundation of red truth and the objective perspective, and the fact that throughout the entire story we may be lied to by the author in any scene that is not confirmed on the basis of our foundation. The subjective perspective can be a complete lie, but some parts may also be symbolic representations of what really happened. So the first thing I want to make clear regarding my theory that the official explanation is a lie is the fact that being lied to by the author is an inherent part of the story. Seeing through the deception is what the reader is called to do from the very beginning. The question then becomes, where does this come to an end? So the difference between my position and the position of the believers in the official explanation is that the believers in the official explanation believe that the deception on the author's part ended near the end of the story, or at least at the end of the story. My position is that this deception endures throughout the entire story until the very end, and even continues after the story ended in interviews with the author. So the difference in these two positions is the extent and duration of the deception. Basically, my position is that we even need to weigh the author's word against the foundation of the Umineko story. What comes down to the fact that the author has to declare the truth in red, or else we cannot be sure if he is telling us the truth or not. And therefore we should solely base what we believe the truth to be on the actual evidence from the story itself. Or to phrase it in another way, the author's words should basically be regarded as purple statements. They may be absolute truth like the red, since he is the author, but if he's a deceiver, then even though his words may seem like absolute truth, he is basically allowed to lie, if you know what I mean. The position of the believers in the official explanation essentially comes down to that the white text from the magical perspective, coupled together with what the author said in interviews, trumps the red truth and even determines how the red truth needs to be interpreted, rather than the other way around. And by doing that, you are basically setting yourself up for being deceived, because you lose the objectivity that is given to you as a rule in the story, and even a game designer needs to play by his own rules. Another thing is that the concept of a deceitful author is actually part of the story itself, namely the witch Aurora or her human form Toya Hachio. Now I believe that Toya, at least in part, represents Ryukishi himself, namely the author of the Umineko novels, which Toya is as well, supposedly. After all, it is part of Enji's perspective that Toya knows the real truth but is hiding this throughout several forgeries. In other words, deception or misrepresentation which obscures the truth. In the final novel, Toya is about to present the real truth to the public, teases them with it, but then decides to not actually show the truth to the public anyway. This truth is in the form of Eva's diary, which only Enji gets to read, but which is obscured to the readers. Moreover, she lied to Enji on multiple occasions as well. Neither she nor Bernkastel really have Enji's best interest in mind. Toya is basically a deceptive author. When it comes to the seventh novel, in which much of the truth is revealed, this is done in a deceitful fashion, and this is even plainly admitted. Also, contrary to the previous novels, this is the first novel without an objective observer. Moreover, neither Enji nor Battler seems to experience this. It is only something that is experienced by the viewer through fictional characters, namely Leon, Wild H. Wright and Claire. Also, the truth is revealed cryptically, especially the whodunit. And, as I said, we are literally told that the seventh novel was specifically written in such a way that people who did not already have come to an understanding regarding Beatrice would be deceived. When it comes to the official explanation, which for the most part came from the seventh novel, the sixth novel and interviews with Ryukishi, the evidence against that explanation being really the truth has been in our faces throughout the entire story. Apart from the first and the last novel, all novels contain lethal evidence against the chicaneries explanation. The second, third and fourth novels all contain red statements confirming that Shannon and Cannon are two separate persons, and the fourth one shows that Beatrice and the person Battler sinned against are not the same person. The fifth novel showed how Shannon and Cannon appeared at the same time from an objective perspective, and the sixth novel gave us the key to unlock the proof from the earlier novels, namely the definition of the word people. Also, the sixth novel contained a hint that we should have been looking for an alternative explanation to the logic error, which I will come back to later. We are also twice forewarned that Shannon is not Beatrice. As I said just now, the red statement in the fourth novel that Battler's sin was not against Beatrice, but also how the seventh novel actually begins. In the beginning of the 7th novel, we see a scene in which a servant girl is falsely accused of being a murderer, and Will destroys this possibility by the red statement, "It's forbidden for a servant to be the culprit." Also, the issue is that the servant girl had no motive. So basically, after the intro, the rest of the novel should be regarded as a improved false accusation towards the servant girl, in which the attempt is made to provide the servant girl with a motive. But if we had actually paid heed to Will's red truth, which cannot be overcome since it's absolute, instead of trying to work around that red statement, which is exactly what Ryukishi expected people to do, as I will address later on, then we would have known that even though it might have seemed that Shannon was Beatrice and the true culprit, we already had the evidence that a different interpretation was required. But most ironically, and probably the most brilliant mindfuck on Ryukishi's part, is that we are literally told that Rosa is the culprit, but nobody would believe that, which is extremely understandable because this happens within the subjective perspective. I'm referring to the 2nd novel in which Canon tells us who killed him and Jessica.
カノンさん、傷口に手を当ててしっかり押さえてください。使用人室に運びましょう。ゴーダ、ローザ様たちに報告を。はい。
待ってください。ローザ様にはダメ。犯人はローザ様。どういう意味なの、カノン君？
今はいい。早く使用人室へ運ぼう。はい。これはひどい。何か槍のようなもので刺されたようです。とにかく止血を。
カノン君、しっかりして。ローザ様が様と僕を。
ローザ様が？そんな。だとしたらバトラ様やジョージ様も危険なのでは。早く何とかしないと。
でも刺激しなければローザ様もむやみには。
あいつは言ったよ。僕たちを皆殺しにする
と。何ですと？
あいつは僕たちを全員殺す。僕が先に殺されたように、みんなも殺される。殺される。殺される。
And also, we are told by Maria that when she is fighting Shannon and Canon in the 6th novel, that she will kill them without mercy, just like her mother killed the others. But then there were also discrepancies between the novel and anime versions. Now many people seem to believe that Studio Dean basically just made certain mistakes, but that's not what Ryukishi said. He said the following, quote, "Will people be able to enjoy the fun of speculation in the anime and manga versions too?" To which Ryukishi replies, "Of course, I have been supervising those very carefully. In Higurashi there were some problems with presentation and they were allowed to do as they pleased in certain areas. But this time I've been checking very carefully to make sure there are no misconceptions in the presentation this time. So I think people will be able to significantly enjoy speculation in those as well." So Ryukishi says that he has been supervising the anime version very carefully. Now I want to direct your attention again to what Ryukishi said regarding Shannon's supposed suicide. Quote, "And while the other two in the room were actually pierced by the stakes, Shannon was not. And that's why you can imagine her being the last to die in that room, because there was nobody left to insert the stake into the gun wound." So Shannon was not pierced by the stake, and this was one of the biggest hints towards Shannon being the culprit. And Ryukishi has carefully supervised the anime version. But in the anime version, Shannon is most definitely pierced by the stake. Wasn't she supposed to have killed herself using the gun on a string trick? Then why is this plainly contradicted in the anime version? Now people who have seen my original Umineko Explained video will know that near the end of that video I had an alternative theory with Shannon and Canon as separate people, by the way, as culprits. But you have to understand that it was a bit tongue-in-cheek when I claimed that Shannon might have killed herself in Natsui's room by smashing her head on top of the stake. I was essentially being ironic by calling it a bit unusual way of killing oneself, which should actually be regarded as an absurd and unbelievable way of killing oneself. My alternative theory with Shannon and Canon in my original video should not have been taken that serious in the first place. The only reason I had it was because I heard of so many people who believed that Shannon and Canon were the culprits, and I had no idea about the Canon theory at that time. So I thought that it might have been possible to get around the red truth regarding their deaths by appealing to the servants' names and their roles as servants who died. Which was absurd and incoherent in the first place, of course, and I didn't actually take that Shannon and Canon theory I had seriously, and when I first heard about the Canon theory, I took it even less seriously. Another thing is the issue of Shannon's corpse not being present inside the garden shed in the first game. Supposedly, Hideyoshi and Canon were lying about Shannon being there, and George would have realized that if he had walked into the shed and would see that there was no corpse. But this hint is actually completely fucked up in the anime version, as it is suggested that as soon as Hideyoshi pointed out that there was in fact a sixth corpse, it is suggested that George actually was able to see Shannon's arm, although he couldn't make out much more than that. Another thing is that the boiler room scenario, which would be one of the best hints for Canon's guild, is not even ever discussed in the anime version. And Shannon lying next to the well without the stake on her body, that's also completely left out. Basically, where is the supposed evidence for the official explanation in the anime version? So why are the most important things left out or even actually contradicted if Ryukishi carefully supervised the anime version to prevent such problems? Or are these discrepancies there on purpose? And what is also very interesting is that Rosa looks extremely similar to Beatrice in the anime version. There's a much bigger difference in how they look in the novel version. In fact, the similarities between Rosa and Beatrice were one of the first things that originally led me to believe that they were in fact the same person. Because I watched the anime version first before reading any of the novels. So in the end, there were plenty of reasons to believe that the official explanation was a deception. So now the only thing left is Ryukishi's motive. Why did he deceive his readers into believing a false explanation? In order to understand Ryuki's motive, let me read a couple of interview quotes. Quote, "Somebody who writes everything including the solution is sure to gain the praise of the readers." To which Ryukishi responds, "I'm not so sure about that. I liked it better when I didn't know everything. Knowing everything kinda ruined it. There are many novels like that. That is why, when I'm asked whether or not I would reveal the truth on the fan disc, I answer, I don't really want to do that." And another quote, "Well, maybe I didn't think of an all-out spoiler." And Ryukishi says, "Doing that is also rude towards the people who arrived at the truth. I also wanted to write a story where you can only get to the truth by reading it for all those people who kept on thinking. But the only guarantee I can give you in return is that if you read the thoughts of those who arrived at the truth now, even the people who did not arrive there can come closer to it. And I guarantee you that if you don't stop thinking, you will arrive at the truth. And by guaranteeing that, maybe some people will arrive there only through that." And another quote, "The people arriving there have arrived because they thought about it. And wouldn't it be inexcusable towards those who have actually put effort into arriving at that truth to just give the answer to those who didn't arrive because they did not think about it? Because I hoped for the fun in Umineko to lie in, thinking and troubling yourself, but reaching the answer through that. I did not create something like a solution section in a riddle book, where you can look for the answers just by opening them. And I think even if I told the people who did not come through the who, how and why, they still would not understand." And yet another quote, "I might have said it during interviews again and again, I absolutely never wanted to do a story where you could just fill in a solution via copy and paste. You said that many times after we had our discussions after the main arcs. Because this is the internet age, somebody could just upload a clear screenshot. Or, if not that, just copy and paste the answer all over the place. People seeing that would just say, 'Is that so?' and dismiss the whole story with that, and that wouldn't be fun at all. That's why I created a way to reveal everything in a way that could not be copied and pasted. To those who think about it clearly, it all becomes clear as daylight." I would like it to become a work for which you can say that again and again, even after some years have passed. But for those who expected there to be a clear answer at the end, it might have been quite a surprise ending. But for me it had already been decided from the start that there would be an ending like this. And yet another quote. I'm glad that there was criticism, but there are also things I need to protect. Those were the people who actually gave their best and arrived at the truth in the end. I think I need to protect the honor and hard work of those people at all costs. After all, it is impossible to create something that gains no criticism at all. And the next quote. But, as I've said before, I don't want to go and say X is the answer, like I did in Higurashi. After all, Umineko is a thinking game, and I want everyone to enjoy discussions. In a puzzle book, if the answer is written on the next page, your thinking stops the instant you see it, right? I am aiming to release the answers in a way that will make those who have reached the conclusion know that they got it right, and yet give only a hint to those who don't yet understand the answer. For example, if we presume that the answer to a riddle was apple, then when we turn to the page and see something round and red, people who thought the answer was apple will think, ah, just what I thought, and have their reasoning confirmed. And for people who didn't know, it becomes a hint. What is red and round? This is the approach I'm aiming for. And the final quote. This kind of work is most fun when you're confused. This time there will be a harsh trap. And while I believe those who have in some way penetrated to the core of the story won't get tricked, those who haven't will probably think, huh? I wish I could say more, but I can't. Let's try to think about this from Ryukishi's position for a minute. Here we have a guy who has pretty much made the longest and most complicated and most brilliant detective mystery ever, and he is rightly afraid of spoilers. In other words, that people can simply copy-paste the answer all over the internet. Ryukishi also rightly makes a distinction between readers who have really thought things through and people who just sat back and wanted the story to explain itself in a way. I myself am in the process of writing a mystery novel and I can completely understand this problem. After all, if you put all the answers in the final chapter of the book, like in And Then There Were None, then people will get near the end and think, damn, I don't understand it, let's see what the answers are. And then have the truth simply revealed to them, even though they don't quote-unquote deserve to know the answers. I mean, it sucks if people actually get to understand the mystery when they haven't truly worked for it. And I believe that this is what Ryukishi's motive for giving a false explanation came from. Couple the foundation of the story together with the fact that deception is an inherent part of the story. Add to that the fact that Ryukishi only wanted the quote-unquote true detectives among the readers, so to say, to know the truth, and I think we have found the reason why the official explanation is impossible, implausible and incoherent, while in fact a coherent and plausible theory does actually exist in its place. So Ryukishi was protecting the cat box from being opened by people who would fall for a deceptive explanation for which lethal evidence against it existed throughout the entire story. So basically, if you could not see through that deception, then you would be left with basically a gold truth that Shannon is the culprit and the same person as Yasu, Beatrice and Canon. And making this deception work was actually pretty easy, because many readers themselves would make it work. After all, it is the problem that I talked about earlier of not having the red as your foundation, but instead having your belief regarding the truth determine how the red should be interpreted. For example, regarding the red truth that a servant cannot be the culprit, people would just come up with all kinds of ways that it wouldn't apply or could be reconciled instead of taking it as a warning. Ryukishi even was really smart how he phrased it when Kia asked him about this statement. The one Van Dyne rule I pained myself about, which actually appeared in red, was, it is forbidden for servants to be the culprit. Is there a game board to which it can actually be applied? To which Ryukishi responds, I actually inserted that red to test whether a player had understood the true culprit in the fullest sense. People who did not understand would clearly be misled. So viewers did exactly what he expected them to do. They would say things like, nah, doesn't apply to any game board, or nah, it means Shannon's Beatrice's personality is the actual culprit, or Shannon solved the epitaph and is therefore not really a servant, or it's already clear that Shannon is the culprit, so it doesn't apply in whatever way. And the same goes for the red statement regarding Shannon's and Cannon's deaths in the third game. People will say things like that Yasu can kill her personality and stuff like that. So it wasn't difficult for Ryukishi to deceive his readers, since those very readers themselves helped along in the deception. Another interesting thing is that Will actually already figured out most of the truth, apart from the details on the why dunnit, before he even came to the island. But he was completely oblivious to Shannon and Cannon supposedly being one person, as we see in the scene where Shannon suddenly acts really weird, when she's supposed to get Cannon because Will wants to talk to them both at once. Of course, Shannon and Cannon are not the same person as Leon anyway in that world, even though that would have to be true given the official explanation. But it's not like Will is trying to trap Shannon or something, he seems to truly be oblivious to the fact that this is supposed to be an issue. And he himself offers to not make a big deal out of it. But what was really brilliant in my opinion is that Ryukishi actually gave us a hint that an alternative explanation to the logic error was required by not allowing the blue truth that the seals on the windows of the next room over were broken at the time of the logic error. Dweller blocks that blue truth. Basically, we are told that it is not allowed to use that blue truth. So you need to explain the mystery without it. So if you would have taken that as a hint, anyone could have realized that there was in fact an alternate explanation. But now there is probably a question on everybody's mind. Namely, if the official explanation was a deception to protect the cat box, then what about Umineko our confession? Why does it even exist then? Doesn't it reveal that Shannon, Cannon and Beatrice are the same person, and also explains many of the tricks? And that there were in fact many accomplices? Or does this little booklet actually serve a very different purpose?